I took to the streets last week while filming my documentary, Gridshock, a film about sex trafficking in Iowa. I wanted to talk to the general public to see how much they knew about sex trafficking and who it impacted. Most of the people that I talked to said that they were aware that it was happening in their communities, but they didn't know a lot about it. When I asked them who they thought the Johns or the buyers of this trade were, everyone gave me blank stares. To be honest, I wasn't surprised by the lack of awareness, especially in regards to buyers. We as a culture don't focus on them. I challenge you today to think differently. Sex trafficking is a modern-day form of slavery where people are bought and sold against their will for sex. Sex trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry fueled by an unbelievable demand from buyers. Sex trafficking is the fastest-growing global criminal enterprise, second only to drug trafficking. I can't think of anything more dehumanizing than sex trafficking. I can't think of anything else that could break the human spirit more than being purchased against your will for the sexual control and gratification of someone else. It was hard for me to fathom what sex trafficking was until I actually sat down and interviewed survivors. Until I heard their stories, I learned more about who the buyers are and why we as a culture should focus on them. I want to share 2 stories. Reagan was a reserved and lonely little girl living in central Iowa, where the Iowa nice culture is an actual thing, a proud identity that us Iowans wear like a badge. This identity tricks us into believing that nothing bad could ever happen here. Around the age of 3 or 4, Reagan was introduced to the sex trafficking industry. Around the age of 3 or 4, her father began selling her for sex. You heard that right, her father. Her father first sold her to her uncle, followed by other family members, family friends, and community members. Her father would take her to local bars where eager buyers would negotiate what the value exchange would be for her and figure out how long they could have with her in the bathroom. She was manipulated into believing that if she wasn't sold for sex, her mom and her grandma would die because they wouldn't be able to afford the medical treatment for her. She loved her mom and her grandma the most, so she never told. For 9 agonizing years, this little girl was sold over and over and over again. She was a product, a commodity. The people that were purchasing her didn't care about her age. These people are people that you walk by in the grocery store. And this little girl looked like the little girls that you see every day. This didn't happen in a faraway country. This happened in our own backyard. And as horrific as that story was, it's not rare. Children are among the most vulnerable to be sex trafficked. Despite the belief that people have to be kidnapped in order to be trafficked, that's not true. Sex trafficking can happen in the context of relationships. People are being sold by their caregivers, their family members, their intimate partners. You name it, and anyone can be trafficked. I want to share another story from Iowa. Heather was a college freshman with dreams of becoming a pharmacist. One day on campus, she met a man who asked her on a date. She agreed, and over time, they developed a relationship, and she trusted him. He got to know her inside and out, her strengths, her weaknesses, her vulnerabilities. So they became boyfriend and girlfriend. It wasn't long after she realized that her boyfriend was actually a sex trafficker. He used those several months to manipulate her into being into the sex trafficking industry. So then it happened. She was a college student by day, and she was sex trafficked by night. She was around hundreds of people every day, and she never felt safe enough to tell anyone what was happening to her. Why? Because the threats were all too real. He would torture her. He would threaten to kill her and her family, and he had already met her family. She told me a story about another woman in this life that threatened to leave. When the trafficker found out, he took this woman back and made an example out of her. He brutally beat her in front of everyone else, just in case they ever thought about leaving too. She never had a choice. Both of those people were able to seek safety, and they are now in recovery. But what Heather told me, she told me this story and I'll never forget it. She said that one day, within a 12-hour period, she was raped 56 times while her sex traffickers in Iowa made $60,000. She was raped 56 times by 56 different people, by 56 different buyers. Are you wondering who the buyers are yet? She described them as businessmen, doctors, lawyers, judges, men with families, sometimes even couples. You might be surprised by what I just told you, but it is actually consistent with the research study conducted by Breaking Free in Minnesota. That study found that the average buyer profile is a 30 to 40-year-old white male who has a college degree, married, with children at home. More than 50% have female children at home. Buyers are people with disposable income. And what is most concerning about this study is that all of those people never had criminal records before, which means they were never on the radar of law enforcement. On the contrary of that study, I've worked with several professionals that say that there isn't an average buyer profile because they've seen everyone. They have arrested people like pastors and school teachers all the way up to seasoned criminals. Anyone can be a buyer so long as they have disposable income. To give you an example of how pervasive it is in our community, I wanted to share an ad that I found from a buyer here in Iowa that was posted on Backpage before it was deleted, or before it got control taken over it. Generous businessman visiting. I host in my hotel evening nights. West Des Moines. Sex trafficking is prevalent in all communities. And even though this is an underground industry, the buyers live among us, in our neighborhoods, in our trusted professions and positions of power. I can't talk about the buyers without talking about the potential for physical violence involved. The survivors I work with say that their buyers would actually pay more money in order to become physically violent with them. I work with victims who have talked about almost being killed by their buyers. There are a lot of arguments out there about whether or not these buyers actually know that they're buying sex trafficking victims, people who are sex slaves. And survivors are actually trained to act like willing participants if buyers are wondering or concerned. So maybe there is a chance that buyers don't know, but I want you to think about a couple things. I want you to think about all of the steps that it took that buyer to go through in order to purchase this person. I want you to think about all the red flags that could have potentially popped up that they chose to ignore. I want you to think about the fact that they actually chose and made the decision to purchase another human being for sexual control, which on all accounts is morally and ethically wrong, not to mention it's all illegal. We have to send a message to buyers that this isn't tolerated. It shouldn't matter if they knew or not. We shouldn't be okay with people purchasing other people for sex. I want to talk about Iowa law. Another thing I learned while filming this documentary is that there's generally a culture of immunity for buyers. The Iowa law says that buyers can actually be charged under the same statute as human traffickers, but whether that happens depends largely enough on the evidence, the prosecutors, and how the case moves forward. We have to demand aggressive prosecution for these buyers. They don't deserve to get a slap on the wrist. They don't. I want to talk about another point that isn't being brought up. If you think about it, sex trafficking is actually a supply and demand industry. On average, sex traffickers make anywhere between $50,000 to $55,000 in 1 week. Although the traffickers are the big orchestrators making the big money, they wouldn't be able to without the buyers. Just like any other marketplace or industry, if there's a change in demand, the entire system will change. If we focused on the buyers, criminalized them, shamed them, then there is no way that these traffickers could make so much in 1 week. The traffickers get the big money, the buyers get the sex, and the survivors, they suffer. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the average life expectancy of someone once they enter the life is only 7 years. They endure rape, exploitation, torture, physical violence. And if these people survive, they will spend the rest of their life struggling with mental, emotional, and physical health problems. And for a lot of them, they spend the rest of their life seeking normalcy and wholeness again. I can't talk about the survivors without talking about the blame and the shame that we as a society put on them. Well, why didn't you tell? Why were you wearing that? Why were you talking to this person online? Aren't those statements familiar? The real blame and shame should be put on the traffickers and the buyers alone. As I stand here today, right now in this moment, there are countless survivors here in Iowa and around the world that are currently enduring exploitation. I want to take a moment of silence to acknowledge those victims. A just society would not let this continue. We have to do better. And it starts with education and action. It starts by calling attention to the buyers who are fueling this demand and perpetuating it. And the longer we continue to let that happen, we continue to fuel the demand. And it becomes this ever-going circle. Survivors deserve to be listened to and heard. Male, female, children, it doesn't matter. We need to hear them. And we need to stop giving second chances to buyers, because buying people is not okay. Now that you know the truth, what will you do? Thank you.